Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. I am just thrilled to welcome Professor Sean Theriault of the University of Texas at Austin for a conversation on his newly released volume, Disruption, the Senate During the Trump Era. And I have to say, as an institute for the United States Senate, we are just thrilled when scholars and practitioners come together to help the public understand more meaningfully the current state of the Senate and its functioning. And so this analysis comes from leading Senate observers from across the political spectrum to explore what happens when the Senate, a tradition-bound institution, encounters a nonconformist president intent on changing how government operates. The chapter authors argue that President Trump became both trapped in the norms and the rules of the Senate while simultaneously upending facets of what was once deemed the world's greatest deliberative body. Professor Theriault will be joined in conversation by chapter authors Professor Christina Bellantoni of USC and Professor Francis Lee of Princeton University to discuss their respective findings and analysis. So before I turn it over to them, I do want to also give a special thank you to our Kennedy Institute members who are joining today's recording as a live audience. And thank you for your support as we look forward to your questions following this expert discussion to you members. And then for those of you watching the recording on YouTube, we invite you to become Kennedy Institute members to get exclusive access to virtual discussions as they're recorded and other member benefits. So without further ado, Professor, over to you and to our experts for your presentation and discussion.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks to the whole team at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate for hosting this event today. I would also like to thank David McBride and his team at Oxford University Press for publishing this book. David is a fantastic editor, and I knew the book would do better because of his efforts. And finally, I want to thank Tiffany White and the Dirksen Congressional Center, who not only provided the idea for this book, but also generously funded it to make sure that it was a success. It is fitting that the Kennedy Institute sponsor an event for a project funded by the Dirksen Center. While the namesakes of these centers were from different parties, they both served in the Senate together, although Kennedy was only at the beginning of his career, as Dirksen was at the end of his. The record doesn't reveal too much about the two of them working together when they overlapped in the Senate. Kennedy, of course, was then a young man in a hurry, and Dirksen was the wily veteran who worked with Lyndon Johnson and Mike Mansfield during one of the most productive eras in Senate history. Even early in his career, Kennedy, at the behest of his father, pursued a judicial nomination for a family friend who had a less than stellar record. As the leader of the opposition, Dirksen developed a file that contained the most damaging evidence against the nominee. Instead of developing a messaging campaign against Kennedy, instead of trying to fundraise off the nomination, instead of trying to publicly embarrass a junior senator, Dirksen back-channeled the information to Kennedy, who promptly withdrew the nomination. Kennedy was smarting not only because of this early defeat, but also because he let his father down. Rather than shaming Kennedy or making fun of him, Dirksen publicly complimented him for having the courage to withdraw the nomination. Kennedy appreciated the kind gesture. As Dirksen recounted later, instead of making an enemy, I made a friend. I'd like to thank Mark Johnson, who wrote a wonderful book about Dirksen and Mansfield, for helping me out with this episode. I think it's important to start out today's event with this Kennedy-Dirksen exchange because it perfectly encapsulates the Senate of the 1960s and 1970s. Fast forward 50 years, and the Senate of today looks very differently. Senators feign outrage to see if their videos go viral. Senators not only question their colleagues' policy prescriptions, but also their motives. Senators attempt to fundraise even at the slightest hint of a scandal. And perhaps most damaging to the institution that both Dirksen and Kennedy loved is that senators used the Senate floor and the legislative process not to solve problems, but to further the political divide in the United States. But enough about my own senator, Ted Cruz. In the book we are discussing today, I assemble a team of 19 authors who wrote 15 chapters about the extent to which the Senate was disrupted during the Trump administration, and by Donald Trump himself. I probably shouldn't reveal the punchline of the book, lest I hurt sales, but I think it's fair for me to say that it isn't a definitive yes or no. It depends. In some ways, the Senate continued traveling down the same trend line that it was on even as Ted Kennedy was leaving the Senate. In other ways, the Senate was sufficiently disrupted that perhaps Senator Kennedy would not even have recognized his beloved institution. As readers work their way through the book, I hope they will keep a few themes in mind. First, the Senate matters. In each of the To each of the authors, the Senate is more than just a second chamber of the legislative branch. It is the one institution in our national government with compromise literally written into its rules. Second, history matters. None of the authors think that the Senate changed only because of President Trump. What preceded his victory in the 2016 election, and perhaps even what caused it, has its roots at least as far back as Barry Goldwater and Strom Thurmond, or perhaps even the Constitution itself. Third, rules matter. While the Senate rules were unchanged under Trump, the manner and frequency with which they were used did change, and the way they were stretched both in frequency and in magnitude was indeed unprecedented. Fourth, leadership matters. Whether being led by Henry Clay, Thomas Reed, Lyndon Johnson, Mike Mansfield, Eb Dirksen, or today's leaders, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, leaders have discretion in the actions they take. They can use that discretion to solve problems or to create them. And finally, Donald Trump matters. With each day of his presidency, it seemed as though new precedents were broken. I guess that goes for the days after his presidency as well. Perhaps no piece of evidence shows this more clearly than what I present in the conclusion to the book. Over the course of the Biden presidency, Donald Trump has been a more popular Google search term than Joe Biden. To put that into perspective, Obama was searched more than 8 times as much as Bush during his first term, and Trump 7 times more than Obama. He truly has been a unique force of nature in the Republican Party and in our governing institutions as well. In order to get the answer to the book's title correct, I assembled a team of authors with different backgrounds. The book includes chapters written by historians, political scientists, journalists, and public servants. They brought different methods to different questions, and unsurprisingly, they arrive at different answers. I hope the readers of the book walk away from their experience with their own unique answer to the question. I also hope that they walk away with a more nuanced understanding of the Senate, Donald Trump, and the political world in which we all find ourselves today. I'm thrilled today to have 2 of the authors with us. First is Frances Lee, professor of politics and public affairs at Princeton University. Frances is the author of 7 books and dozens of articles. Her books have won a variety of awards, including the best publication on the topic of American national policy, the best book in legislative studies, and the best book published on a congressional topic. And I should note that each of these awards were for different books. Frances had 2 co-authors on her chapter. Both Bettina Poirier and Chris Bertrand played a variety of roles on Capitol Hill and even in the White House. They both hang their hats today at American University. Frances herself has served as a congressional fellow on Capitol Hill. Their chapter gives us a nuts and bolts understanding of how the Senate tried to manage the crisis brought about by the coronavirus. And I have, Frances will now describe some of the findings from her chapter.
Thank you, Sean. And thanks not just for the kind introduction, but also for bringing together this terrific and diverse group of contributors for this volume. Thanks also to the Kennedy Institute for giving us the opportunity to share the work that we've done. As Sean mentioned, I had the pleasure of co-authoring this chapter with a set of longtime congressional negotiators. Bettina Poirier, who spent a decade as staff director and chief counsel for the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and Christopher Bertram, who, among other roles in DC policymaking, served as staff director of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Our chapter examines how Congress succeeded in enacting the huge pandemic relief packages of 2020. This was by far the largest policy response to any domestic policy crisis in American history. In inflation-adjusted terms, Congress spent more in 2020 than it did in the historic 2009 stimulus and the whole New Deal combined. COVID aid expenditures in 2020 roughly matched what the U.S. spent on war production in 1943. This agreement got reached in an environment that was decidedly not friendly for major policymaking. You had divided government, different parties controlling the House and Senate, and extreme party polarization. The CARES Act passed less than 2 months after the end of Trump's first impeachment trial. This was not a context well suited to major policymaking, and yet it happened. We analyze how Congress reached agreement on pandemic relief in 2020 through the lens of the negotiation literature. This is an area of scholarship that's more widely developed or used in business schools than in departments of political science. But the approach offers some good traction in thinking through how legislative deals come together. A key concept in the negotiation literature is what's known as the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or what's referred to as the BATNA. This concept embeds the important idea that the side who is able to walk away from a negotiation will have more leverage. During the COVID crisis, neither party had that kind of leverage. Neither really had a walkaway option. Members of both parties almost universally believed that it was going to be essential to reach a deal. This is probably the most important factor in reaching agreement, was that lack of any acceptable alternative for either side. As Senator Marco Rubio said during the March 2020 negotiations, we are facing the abyss. We also look at how Majority Leader Mitch McConnell helped to discover what negotiation scholars refer to as the zone of possible agreement in the negotiation, the ZOPA, by engaging in what is known as all-party mapping. To construct an all-party map, a negotiator needs to anticipate all those who will matter for the eventual success of any deal. Savvy negotiators will need to identify and address everyone who can serve as a possible influencer, possible ally, or an opponent in deal making. We looked at the working groups that McConnell convened to put together the various parts of the CARES Act. These groups typically incorporated chairs and ranking members of key committees in the Senate. These members would have resented any abrogations of their authority. But McConnell also looped in members with strong interest in the issues, even if they weren't on the relevant committees. For example, Senator Pat Toomey was brought into the group working on oversight of the Treasury Department, even though he didn't have a jurisdictional claim on the issue. This looks like a case of McConnell anticipating a potential blocker in the negotiations. We also looked at how repeated interactions, the fact that throughout all of these negotiations, the players expected to have to work together again on the next deal, and how that led them to behave in more responsible and honest and congenial ways than would otherwise be the case. I mean, the fact that you're embedded in an ongoing set of relationships is a key constraint on excessive partisanship even now. Question, of course, for the volume is what was Trump's role in all of this? As best as we could tell, he did not have a lot of influence over the details of the CARES package. He put forward some ideas, such as a payroll tax cut, but they failed to get traction even among Senate Republicans. He made it clear to everyone, including the right wing of the party, that he wanted to go big. And that's probably his most important influence on the negotiations, in that he never imposed any upper limit on the total cost of the CARES Act. And so in the end, the CARES Act became this huge log roll that contained something for everyone in its more than 800 pages and more than $2 trillion of spending. You know, spending effectively doubled over the course of the negotiations. When McConnell made his opening bid in the negotiations, the package stood at a cost of $1 trillion. And by the time it was done, it was at $2.2 trillion. My co-authors and I conclude that the episode shows that Congress remains a transformational legislature. Unlike many other legislatures around the world, Congress does not just react to executive branch proposals. Congress writes legislation, and it does so in both broad terms and in specific detail. In crafting the COVID bills, Congress was not just saying yes or no to proposals from the administration. The negotiations featured co-equal bargaining across the parties in the Senate, across the House and the Senate, which are controlled by different parties, and then across the branches of government between the Congress and the president. Finally, we'd argue that Congress's response to the COVID crisis of 2020 shows that it is still able to leap into life and transcend partisan stalemate when faced with a major problem on which all sides agree action is needed. So I'll kick it back now to Sean, who will then invite further discussion of the chapters in the volume.
Thanks, Frances. I'm also pleased that we have Christina Bellantoni with us today. Christina is the director of the Annenberg Media Center at the University of Southern California. Christina has worked for more than 20 years in journalism. She cut her teeth as a cover reporter for the Washington Times. Her career in media also includes stints as the political editor at the PBS NewsHour, editor-in-chief at Roll Call, and assistant managing editor for politics at the Los Angeles Times. I was pleased when Christina decided to share her experiences and teach the next generation of reporters in her current role today. I'm thrilled to have her voice in the book and for you to have the opportunity to hear from her today. Christina?
Thanks so much, Sean. Really appreciate you and the Kennedy Institute for this just incredible moment to be able to talk about something that I do love dear, which is the United States Senate. And I'll start at just a moment just to say I'm not at my best this morning. As many of you may be aware, we are in the middle of a really fascinating crisis on college campuses. And my students were out all night long covering what was going on our campus at USC, and then also what we saw happen at UCLA, our big rival, who is not super close to USC. So the students were going back and forth all morning, and it's been a little crazy. So it's nice to kind of take my mind off of it and think of a different moment. And that also sets up a little bit how I got involved with this, because I consider Sean a friend. And when he first approached me to tell me he was doing this, I immediately thought like, oh, I'm not an academic. And I realized, well, 6 years ago today, I gave my first job talk to be able to get this role that I have at USC. I'm working in this incredible building right behind me. And I guess I am an academic. And now especially, I feel like one, thanks to you and the support from the Dirksen Center and all of those wonderful people that you thanked. And I do still feel incredibly humbled to be able to think about the U.S. Senate and Trump's, role and whether he disrupted it at this moment in time, given, the longevity of my career, what I've witnessed. I feel like I really had the privilege to work in Washington and particularly leading Roll Call and seeing Congress really change. I was sort of in that moment where we had this market shift. So when Sean approached me, I started thinking about what would I want to write about this? What are my conclusions? And I kept coming back to this idea of the myth of the moderate senator. And it was sort of inspired by a piece that a friend of mine, also a former journalist who has now moved into public relations and consulting, had been a Senate reporter and had sort of gone after Susan Collins, looking at this is something the media created Susan Collins in the way that she was always like the one vote people wanted to cover or amplify. And she's the one being chased by the television cameras. And if you actually examined her work and her role, she never really was a moderate. And I was thinking about that and sort of noodled around on a lot of different ideas. And I realized that going through my own experiences covering the Senate and what I had witnessed over time would be the way to approach this. So I effectively treated it like a reporting assignment, feeling very different from an academic. And the first thing that I did, and I'll return to this because this is how the chapter concludes, was start to call some of my Republican senator sources and even friends to talk to them, right? The people we've already heard their names mentioned here, starting with Mitch McConnell, of course, but, Senator Pat Toomey. I talk quite a bit about Senator Lindsey Graham, going through all of the different Republican senators who had a role in this giant change that we have seen in the U.S. Senate. Rob Portman, people who were retiring like him. So I just started calling. We got lots of time, get an interview on the books. And I was going nowhere. And I kept thinking, is this just me? Like, I'm out in California now. They forgot all about me. It's been a while since I've been standing in the hallways. And what I conclude is, no, it was not me. And also something that I concluded after going through the chapter, which I'll tell you about in detail, I am an institutionalist. it took me a minute to get there. As I was working through this with Sean and with the other incredible academics who were part of this book, that was really the question. Like, it's not actually really about the moderate Republican, it's about the institution of the US Senate and how that has just been frayed. And my real conclusion is that actually Trump did not start that. He sort of threw some gasoline on a fire that was already smoldering. So the issue that really crystallized this for me was something I had covered extensively at all of those different publications that Sean mentioned. So I started actually with Senator Joe Lieberman, now the late Senator Joe Lieberman, who passed away last month. And I talked to him extensively about some of the things that he and I had covered, or that I had, sought him as a source for, particularly immigration reform and legislation about climate. Back in, 2000, sort of the 2005 through 2010 period of time when there were, lots of gangs of blank and attempts for bipartisan compromise on major issues, but especially immigration. And when George W. Bush was president, we saw this really bipartisan push with senators from each side coming together to say we have to do some sort of comprehensive immigration reform. That was the buzzword. And then we also saw the right just completely ignite. They melted switchboards down in Congress for the first time. People were just calling from across the country, inspired, from calls by people like Rush Limbaugh, and many on the conservative right who said, this was just another amnesty deal and you had to activate. And that really set this tempo of senators starting to feel vulnerable. For the most part, people could be reelected in their home states. They weren't being challenged by their own party. Yes, there had been rises and falls of which party was in favor, but you weren't seeing these wars, particularly within the Republican Party, until that moment. That's when it just got so exacerbated. So I walked through the story and Joe Lieberman talking about what happened with Lindsey Graham and how Lindsey Graham had to walk away, saying, look, I'm just getting completely hammered at home. I cannot be part of these deals anymore. And then I talk a little bit about this moment where I sort of started to think about the conservative challenges or the far right challenges within Republican Senate primaries. And it actually started when the late Senator Robert Bennett was ousted during the Utah Republican Convention in 2010. This was the year that we saw the Tea Party wave, and we saw many Republican primaries sort of end up with these battles, many of them over the issue of immigration. And so we talk about that, and Lieberman, talked extensively about how he viewed Trump's influence on the party during his time. And then the deals have sort of fallen apart many times. You've seen many of these senators, including now in the last several months, Senator James Lankford, still at the table to try to discuss immigration reform in the Senate and make something happen. And we talk about how Trump could poison any progress that had been made with just one tweet. He would go after even allies. We saw that with former Senator Sessions, who became his attorney general. We saw him and his Homeland Security Department go after Lindsey Graham among these negotiations. And you would start to see more and more Republicans not show up at those meetings, those bipartisan meetings where they were trying to get something done. So I walked through kind of how that all fell apart, and Lankford's very harsh words for a lot of it. And how you just never got anything done. Now, I teach political reporting, and I talk every single semester. I have an entire unit about how I truly believe there's actually no political incentive for anybody to come together on immigration reform, because it ignites their bases so fervently, and it helps them with fundraising and helps them reach certain demographics within their campaigning. So nobody really wants to solve this issue. It's all a lot of theater anyway. That's not really in this chapter, but I do believe that. And I think that's a lot of what played here. So we kind of talked through what Trump did and how he did it. Then I start to talk about this concept of the middle, and names you will all be familiar with: John McCain, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Jeff Flake of Arizona, Mitt Romney of Utah, Rob Portman, Bob Corker, right? They are characters in media portrayals of the United States Senate as that theater takes place, and talk about this Senator Susan Collins situation that Meredith Shiner wrote for the New Republic, and examine that, and also started to do a lot of critical thinking about my own role as a journalist, and where I also did that. You go to the handful of people and you elevate their voice, which then gives the impression to your audience and also to all of the people responding to media cues that the people with the loudest voices, the people with the most fiery positions, they get the attention, and then the moderates get the attention, and then a lot of the people that really want to get work done, that do that just basic normal working of the Senate, their voices are drowned out, and again, there's not much incentive to do that. So one of the big sources from the book was the Lugar Center, named for the late Senator Dick Lugar, who also was one of those people who would come together for big issues that were very important. And they've done a lot of incredible research about Supreme Court justices, but also about legislation that had passed. And they found that there was actually a little bit of good work that was being done kind of quietly with senators who wanted to notch a success when they were watching Trump over here and thinking about their own reelection. A lot of that quiet work actually did get done under the Trump administration, but the big things that kind of needed compromise, Trump was able to really just light them on fire and make them not function. Now, finally, I had a lot of time with Senator Mark Warner, who is someone I covered as when he was governor, back when I started at the Washington Times, and I was covering him as Virginia governor, knew him very well, and talked to him about some of these specific things where people came together, where they were sitting at the table in both parties. The CARES Act, which Professor Lee talked about so eloquently, it was one of the main things that he discussed. Where this was really an important moment where Congress transcended politics. And he said similar things, that like the Trump White House allowed it to happen, but were not super involved. They let the Senate do what it did best and come up with something that really helped a lot of people. Then finally, I kept thinking as I was writing this chapter a lot about the most extraordinary thing I ever witnessed when I was covering Congress, which had nothing to do with immigration or Trump. It was when Senator Mike DeWine had lost re-election during 2006, when the Democrats had won back control of the Senate. And he spent his final days of the lame duck session taking to the Senate floor over and over and over again to pay tribute to the troops that had died from Ohio in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which he had supported. And I had written this story then. It was fine. And I feel like I didn't quite do it justice. And so I sort of retell the story in this chapter to get at where the Senate can do things that make the American people proud, where the Senate can transcend the latest cable news meme or moment, that there really is an opportunity there to showcase what the Senate is for and to be an upstanding leader. And then I talk about the media's role, which is something that I do all the time, every day now while I'm at USC and leading this media center, really recognizing like how damaging the media has been to all of this. And this chapter for me, I now look at it as kind of a love letter to the US Senate that I always believed was possible and only witnessed a few times. Most of my love affair with the U.S. Senate has been ended in disappointment. But then recognizing my own role in being part of the media, maybe that never was, right? I was aspiring and in love with something that was just a media creation. And then the final conclusion is none of the Republicans ever wanted to talk. Not one, not retiring senators, not people who had incentive to do it. They really just wouldn't get engaged in this, even for something that is so important, and taking this really close look at Trump's role in the Senate. So hopefully I've got the right amount of time there, and thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Christina. And you call it a love letter to the Senate. I wonder if it's a Dear John letter to the Senate.
There you go.
So now I have the good fortune of being able to ask Francis and Christina some questions, but I will prep the people who are joining us online in the audience that we will have time for Q&A. And just so I can gauge how much time I should spend just with Francis and Christina and how many questions you have, if you already have a question, if you just go ahead and raise your hand now, then I can gauge exactly how much time we have, and that would be really helpful. And first, I want to ask a question of each of the authors independently, and then I'll ask some questions more generally. So my first question is to you, Francis, right? So I think you do such a nice job of explaining how the Senate kind of rises to the moment and how, right, like the CARES Act and kind of dealing with the COVID virus was it gave them this opportunity to put their best face forward. And so my question to you is, how much of that is the global pandemic that we were all in, right? The unprecedented nature of that this was having on both our health, our mental health, the economy. Like, is it the COVID crisis that creates the opportunity for the Senate to look good? Or do you think had that crisis not arisen, that there would have been some other issue on which the Senate could have put their best face forward?
Well, that's a great question, Sean. And it's a difficult one. But what I would say is if we take a broad view of how Congress responds to crisis, I'd say Congress has a reasonably good track record of being able to come together and act in circumstances that are widely acknowledged as a crisis. So if we look back to the financial crisis of 2008, Congress came together to pass the TARP package, which stopped the panic in the financial sector. And it did that despite divided government and amidst a presidential election. Obviously, there was a lot of quick action immediately after the 9/11 attacks. So this is probably why everybody wants to use the crisis terminology when pushing their favorite causes, from the climate crisis to the crisis at the border, because Congress is able to act in the context of crisis. Of course, the challenge is that the parties don't often agree on what a crisis is. If we look back to the 116th Congress of 2019-2020, before the pandemic, it was reasonably productive on various issues, though your mileage will vary in terms of whether you'd grant that Congress really faced the big challenges facing our country. But in addition to COVID aid, Congress in divided government after the 2018 midterms enacted paid parental leave for federal civilian workers, a major new national parks bill that established a new funding stream for land and water conservation. That was the Great American Outdoors Act, and a new trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, one that was, unlike NAFTA, supported by labor. So these were significant issues, all of which were and had to be handled on a bipartisan basis. If we then fast forward to the 117th Congress under Biden, the first 2 years of the Biden presidency, Congress got a lot done then as well, much of it bipartisan, including the infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Respect for Marriage law, and the PACT Act for veterans' health care. Even here in the 118th Congress, meaningful stuff is getting done. There was a major foreign aid authorization, plus the TikTok ban just last month. Also, a significant deal on the budget in the context of the need to raise the debt limit crisis, or to address the debt limit in advance of a crisis, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So I think Congress often does not get sufficient credit for what it does well. There's a lot of negativity in news coverage, as Christina was referencing, and so I think that's part of the story of the public's disaffection with the institution and its persistently low public approval. But I think to some extent Congress gets a bad rap, that it does better than it gets credit for.
And this is one of the things that I really like about your research, Francis, is that, like, when it seems like there are lots of gray clouds in the political environment we're living in, you will always find, right, the evidence to say, well, right, there is that narrative, but there's another counter narrative that we shouldn't dismiss too quickly. And so, all right, I appreciate that answer. And now to Christina, right? So you wrote about the end of the institutionalized Senate, and right, I just love the the episode that you talk about Mike DeWine, right? Like you spoke about it eloquently during your presentation, but even your writing of it in the book is just fantastic. And so I encourage everyone to at least take a look at that part of your chapter. I think it's fair to say that the Senate, as Francis just told us, has accomplished more during the Biden administration than most people would have thought heading into it. Right? So we had to submit these chapters, right? The book is going to be published. Is there anything that's taken place between your final handing in of that chapter and now where you're rethinking your conclusions? Or are there additional episodes that you wish that you could have added to your chapter even as it was going to press?
Yeah, I love this question. And some of it is the items that Francis mentioned, looking at big sweeping legislation, infrastructure bill, Build Back Better, the ability to pass a budget. And also there were a couple of interesting, like Electoral Count Reform Act, right, which is actually aimed to prevent anybody from doing what happened on January 6th, some gun reform. There are things that have happened. Even this week, the Senate is actually quietly about to pass this like totally boring FAA authorization before its May 10th deadline. And like, that's not going to get a ton of attention because nobody's yelling at each other on it. I'm sure they'll find a way. There are, some amendment fights that are going to happen. So that is part of it. But I think even those things that I mentioned that President Biden, for example, wants to go out there and campaign on, people do not understand them, think about them, talk about them in the same terms from a standpoint of the voters. So we already know that meat, potatoes, and broccoli that the Senate is doing is just not having the same effect because of what you mentioned at that very top. People care about Trump. Trump dominates the conversation. Trump is going to continue to dominate the conversation and is almost setting the agenda for what the American people learn about through the media and also what they're caring about when they're responding to pollsters. And so that kind of cycle is just continued and all of that. The one, if I could write another episode, it would be about this extraordinary thing that happened with Mitt Romney. As we talked about this, effectively Romney decides he's going to retire and he brings on McKay Coppins to write this biography. And he hands over chapters and diaries and notes and text messages and just all of this incredible, this is a reporter's dream to have this kind of source material, which I think actually makes my argument even more because you get a sense of what this just absolutely unprecedented power that Donald Trump has over his party. There were a couple examples of things Romney said where, again, he had copious notes on this that he gave to McKay. Where Trump would speak at the Senate luncheon to the senators and they'd all show him respect and they'd say the right thing in front of the camera. But the moment he walked out of the room, they burst out laughing and things like this. What is actually happening behind closed doors versus in public? And how are people so captivated by this person? So those things I would have loved to be able to spend more time and argue that. And then I have been thinking a lot about Senator Lieberman, who I covered, for many years. And, it was sort of, I remember Playbook had this note. It was like Senator Lieberman's last op-ed and the last big interview with Senator Lieberman. I was thinking, well, I didn't have the last big interview with him. I did the interview 2 years ago. But in some ways, I feel like he's speaking from the grave. And it does matter politically. Right after he died, you saw a complete unraveling of the no labels movement. They're not putting forth a presidential candidate. This was something he had been advocating for a really long time, what he stood for and what he attempted to do with either you could call it true bipartisanship or the way that he kind of talked about it to me. This quote, I didn't actually use it in the chapter, but I found it in my notes for this today. He said, "Being a centrist is a strategy. It's a tactic. Are you willing to come from wherever you are to see if you can negotiate compromises?" And I love that. And I just don't think anyone really acts that way in the United States Senate today.
Yep. You want to know who would love that quote? Francis and her co-authors, right? Exactly part of their arguments they make is trying to figure out that zone where you can find possible agreement. So I'm going to ask a 3-part question, but first a preface, right? So I think we can all agree that the Senate is going to be in transition, right? So Senators Romney, Manchin, and Sinema are all retiring. And those are the 3 folks that we'd look to see if there was going to be some kind of compromise that could be reached. There's certainly, there could be a new majority, right? The Republicans could become the majority in the next Congress. There certainly will be a new Republican leader, as Mitch McConnell has already announced that he won't be the leader in the next Congress. So my first part of the question is, how will these transitions affect the Senate? And maybe I'll go to Christina first, and then Francis, you can answer.
Yeah, and they really, each thing is really different from one another, right? I can play out all of these scenarios. I was thinking about this, and in some ways, I always come back to that optimism too. And in the last few years, it's been harder to do that. But I do see a scenario where Republicans win control of the Senate, Donald Trump is president again, and you have all of these people kind of in the orbit of government who recognize, like, we have a really limited amount of time before the midterm elections to get things done. And those things are going to be, on this side of the agenda, which is not going to make a lot of the middle and the left happy, but they could accomplish quite a bit. You could see that. You could see senators who really want to get his backing on things that they want to change. You could see even like regulations really significantly changing on everything from our climate and water and air to health, many, many things within agencies could change. I could see that. I also can see a further divided government. And if you have, just a 1-seat majority, or if it's, things are just on the balance, you could see a complete stalemate and it's all just legislation by X or True Social or whatever that might be again, and things could get quite broken. But I see a little bit of that silver lining should that happen. Now, with the new Republican leader, Cornyn is a different beast. Like they're similar in all they vote for, but they are just different people. And I think that having that different approach and even just the different voice standing up on the Senate floor, like you really saw a lot of that when Schumer took over for Harry Reid. It's a different Senate, it does shift that dynamic, and Cornyn brings some things to him. And he also, my interactions with him, I found him to really feel like, he's been around a long time. He's been here long before Trump. And I think he views himself as sticking around long after. So you might see something there. And then, the non-optimistic part, I do think about, what type of senator is elected. And do you get, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world on the Senate floor, more of them, because we already have that. And is that productive? And does that further unravel the institution? I don't see a whole lot of Jeff Flake's, on the ballot this election year. And I just see a lot of dispute over elections. And I actually recently wrote a piece, I should send this to you, Sean, I haven't yet, about the film, the Alex Garland film, Civil War, that is out, because I had the opportunity to see the premiere. And I wrote about it from a journalism lens, what I teach my young students. But watching that film, I was profoundly upset. I'm really, really bothered by seeing these institutions. There's a shot, I'm not giving anything away, it's in the trailer, where there's like a scene where the Lincoln Memorial like gets blown up. And it's just horrifying and shocking. And I do have some fear that we're going to see unrest in this country, regardless of the election result, that will affect these institutions that I hold so dear.
Great. Francis?
Well, Sean, it's certainly true that many of are a key group of senators who have built a reputation for moderation are retiring, and that raises questions about deal making going forward. I guess as I try to look on the bright side, I keep in mind that when deals come together in the Senate and in Congress generally, they tend to be very broadly supported. You don't see very many deals that happen with just a handful of the moderates actually deciding the outcome. That the deals look more like the foreign aid legislation that just passed, with so large majorities in support when they actually come together. And those happen not because the parties like each other or because they agree. I mean, I don't depart from the view that Congress is deeply polarized along party lines, but they come together because they have to, because it's the only way to accomplish any of their goals. And so it's a constraint that they are subject to that disciplines them to reach agreements where agreements can be reached, where there is a zone of agreement. Not in all cases, but it does happen. And certainly, we can point to a lot of significant legislation that's passed just in the past 6 to 10 years. So, I would look at it from that vantage point rather than focusing on a set of individual members. On the question of of Senate leaders, I take a sort of similar view that members who move into leadership often behave quite differently once they get there than they did when they were rank and file members. You can certainly see that as Mike Johnson in the House has transitioned into the speakership. Like, he's a very different figure now that he's Speaker of the House than he was when he was just a rank and file Republican from Shreveport. Senator Cornyn has a reputation for deal making already that he would bring if he were the next Republican leader. And I think one of the more significant episodes illustrating that was his willingness to resist the base of the party on gun control issues in negotiating the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So I see some possibility there. Another likely candidate for a Republican leader would be Senator John Thune, who has maintained quite a bit of distance from the populist wing of the party, despite representing a very red state. So I think it's certainly an open question. But I as I look towards these transitions, I don't see a particular reason for increased pessimism. And I think it's also important to recognize that the Senate Republican Party remains quite divided. And you can see these divides very clearly on last month's major foreign aid authorization, just as you saw it on a whole host of issues during the Trump presidency. So if we have another Trump presidency, you'd expect the president to continue to have difficulty with the Senate, even if there's a Republican majority in the Senate. And of course, the Senate will be difficult for any president due to the filibuster and the low likelihood that any party will have that kind of large majority. But even if we just consider a potential unified government scenario, internal divides within the Republican Party were a significant check during the first Trump presidency. They would be operative again.
Right. The amazing thing in me asking this question is I promised the audience a 3-part question, but as an indication of how thorough Frances and Christina are in answering the question, they answered parts 2 and 3 without me even asking it. So kudos to them. And that's good for us because I know that there are some questions for the audience. And so Pamela, I think, had her hand up first.
I was really intrigued by the comment when someone mentioned being an institutionalist after doing research for this project. And one of the fundamental roles of the Senate is to serve as a check and balance to the executive and judicial powers. When the Senate isn't functioning well, it seems like it's losing some effectiveness and its ability to serve as a check and balance. And I was wondering, especially in a closely divided Senate, or, depending on which party's in the White House, do you see the Senate? Are you optimistic that the Senate can continue serving its role as a check and balance, or are you seeing that power kind of eroded? And what can the Senate do to sort of reestablish its norms in our system of government to serve as its check and balance?
So, Pamela, that's a great question. And I know how Frances and Christina are going to answer it, but I'm going to let them answer it themselves. And so first, Frances and then Christina, maybe, just give short answers if you could.
It's certainly a worrisome feature of our political system right now that the Congress has great difficulty acting in response to judicial rulings or to presidential unilateralism. In other words, coming together as an institution to protect Congress's power and to protect the system of checks and balances. But what I would look to as I think about the next Congress and a new president is that the Senate retains an important check and balance in the form of its ability to confirm nominees. And that you should watch the exercise of that power, not just in terms of the rare occasions when the Senate actually rejects a nominee in a vote, but for the many, many occasions when the Senate refuses to move forward on a nomination. And so there's checks and balances happening there, even though the conflict is not always fully out in the open. So it's definitely a concern, but it's worth paying attention to when Congress sits on its hands and drags its feet when the administration is asking for action, because that is also a form of checking and balancing.
Sure, it's that dog that doesn't end up barking, right? Where you see some of that check and balance. And maybe before I throw it over to Christina, I'll just let Fatima know that she's on deck to ask her question. Christina?
Yeah, I agree with everything Francis has said. And I'll just add, there is a scenario where Joe Biden is reelected and there are Republicans controlling the Senate. And I think you're going to have a lot of people talk about that check and balance and a lot of problems with nominations in that instance, if that were to happen. And one other thing that I could also see happening, where I was talking about that sort of optimistic, a lot of things could get done under a second Trump presidency. You also, the people who went to go physically work around President Trump during his time, a lot of them were not sort of creatures of Washington. He had some people that came in and out. A lot of that didn't work. But I think if there were a second term and people really take this seriously as like, okay, we have this limited window to get things done, I think you're going to see more and more of those creatures of Washington. And I mean that in a positive way, people who understand the functions of government and that institutional thing. You're going to see actual real congressional liaisons, try to work with Congress and particularly that Senate if we see it in Republican hands. So I see a little bit less of that. You're going to have the Senate stop the president or something like that. And in the end, I look at January 6th as a good example, right? Congress did come to its senses, and it was a terrible day that could have ended much worse. And that is something that I just sort of personally look at. And then the other thing is they love their role as being able to be the final say on a lot of things. And I can't see that changing even with the makeup inside of the Senate changing.
I think that's probably true. And Fatima, we have just a couple of minutes left, but go ahead and ask your question. Maybe we can get just a quick answer from Christine and Francis.
One of the lasting legacies of the Trump presidency was his nomination of 3 Supreme Court justices. And I'm wondering if any of you can speak to how the functioning of the Senate was affected by the nominees he chose in that process.
Wow. So I'm going to ask you both to give your quickest possible answers. And so why don't we go to Christina first on this one?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's particularly the final choice of Amy Coney Barrett. Like, they moved that so swiftly. And while it said a lot about the partisan state of our world, the Senate worked exactly well, and they, plowed it forward and they kept to tradition. And in the end, like, those votes were enough to seat Barrett.
I mean, I guess as we think about how those nominations affected the operations of the Senate, we'd need to point to the move towards simple majority cloture on confirming Supreme Court nominations. And that's really transformed the way the president will interact with the Senate going forward. That's unlikely to be undone. And it means that future nominations under conditions of unified government, you would not expect to have much bipartisan support for nominees. And so the way presidents make these nominations and the way the Senate responds to them has been lastingly changed.
Right. And I can't help but ask just this final question, maybe just get a yes and no out of both of you. Right. Will we ever see a Senate that is controlled by the opposite party of the president approve a Supreme Court nominee? Or are we now just ever going to have that seat being filled when we have a president in the Senate of the same party?
I say no. I think the precedent just got shredded.
Yeah.
The precedent is important. It's certainly established that the Senate can resist seating a nomination or a new nominee. But the question is, how long can you keep a seat open? I do think the pressures will vary depending on what nominee or which member of the court steps down or dies. and so what the replacement would mean for the composition of the court, and also how long the seat would otherwise be vacant. I think those would create different pressures on the institution, so that we can't. I wouldn't want to offer a blanket no reply.
Right. And I can't help, right, Christina, instantly when I asked the question, I thought, but Lisa Murkowski, right? But your chapter tells me I can't start looking to Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins. But maybe literally if Joe Biden is reelected, there's a vacancy. If he goes to Lisa and says, you name the nominee and I'll put that person forward, like that might be enough of the dynamics. Right. What I'm learning in this conversation is that we need to do a second volume, and we need to do a second one of these podcasts to talk about both this volume and that volume. And maybe with that, I'll throw it back to Adam for maybe some concluding comments.
Well, thank you so much, professors, for creating this volume, for your engaging conversation today on the book. It is vital that we all take the time to understand our governing institutions and evolving dynamics at play. So thank you for assisting in that process. And we hope that all of you have enjoyed today's conversation. To our Kennedy Institute members who have joined our live audience, thank you for your questions and your support. And for those watching on YouTube, we invite you to go to our website as well and become Kennedy Institute members today for exclusive access to virtual discussions like the one today, and other benefits. So thank you, everyone, and please join us again.